King Edward IV was crowned, aged 19, in June of 1461, having, as the head of the Royal House of York, taken the throne from his ailing rival and cousin, King Henry VI of the House of Lancaster. He would, as it turns out, reign twice. His first reign would last for nearly 9 years, until October 1470, when machinations by the Earl of Warwick the Kingmaker, resulted in a resumption of hostilities, and Edward's temporary deposition in favour of the returning Henry VI. Having defeated Henry a second time, he reigned again from April 1471 to April 1483. The demise of Henry and of his son Edward of Westminster in May of 1471 assured the continuance of his rule. Edward from the beginning had a strong attachment to Windsor Castle, and once he was secure in his throne, he began, like kings before him, to build, and he commenced the construction of a new chapel dedicated to St George in the lower bailey of Windsor Castle, to replace one that had originally been constructed by King Henry III. This new chapel was to be both a home for the Order of the Garter and also his royal family mausoleum. In July of 1475, having set in train plans for the construction of this chapel, Edward IV then set off to invade France. At Sandwich, before he embarked to the continent, he made provision in his will for his burial place and also for the construction of his tomb, and in another video I talk about those lavish provisions. 8 years later, when Edward died rather suddenly in April of 1483, aged only 40, neither the chapel nor the elaborate provisions for his tomb had been completed. He imagined, I suppose, he had years ahead of him to finish them. His brother Richard III had no time to complete them, nor was his son-in-law Henry VII inclined to do so. Edward was therefore buried with great royal pomp, but in an unmarked burial vault beneath the pavement just to the north of the high altar of the chapel. Although unmarked, this was the prime spot in the chapel for burial, the one that was usually reserved in this period for the burial of a founder of a church or a chapel. We know rather a lot about the burial vault of Edward, as in 1789 it was opened and entered. But before we get to the details of all of that, in order to understand what was discovered in 1789, it will be helpful to relate what we know about the preparation of Edward's corpse for burial. Usefully, there is a manuscript in the College of Arms written by the heralds that describes both the preparation process of Edward's corpse and the funeral rituals, which was intended to be a primer, a guide for future sovereigns' burials. Edward's body, it records, was first spurged, i.e. asperged, sprinkled with holy water. It was then washed and was then anointed with holy oil by a bishop. The king's body was then wrapped in lawn, fine linen cloth, and he was dressed in his hose and his shirt, with a pair of red leather shoes on his feet. He was then dressed in a surcoat of cloth, with a cap of estate on his head, like the caps of estate you see inside crowns, and he was laid on a board covered in cloth of gold. One hand was placed on his belly, a sceptre was placed in the other, and for greater dignity, a kerchief was placed over his face. And he was displayed to the nobles of the court like this for 2 days, or, as the document rather grimly says, for as long as the weather would endure it, which of course means until there were physical signs of decomposition. Then they disembowelled him and they bamed him, i.e. they rubbed his body with bame or balm, perfumed oil. It is this process from which we derive the word embalming. His body was then wrapped in reins well trammelled in cords of silk, reins being a very fine rich linen, then in a layer of tartrin trammelled, perhaps a fine silk from Tartary, the area to the north of China that includes Mongolia and Afghanistan. That word trammelled means to tie. Then over the tartrin was a layer of velvet, and then a final layer of cloth of gold. And after all this wrapping, they were then to lead him. They were to put him in a soldered lead shell, and then they were to coffer him in a wooden coffin. Before it was put in the wooden coffin, the body of King Edward IV in its lead shell would have looked just like these. The lead shells of Edward's daughter Elizabeth of York, her husband Henry VII, and their descendant James I in their burial vault in Westminster Abbey. Now, with all of these layers and wrappings, it is easy to see why the bodies of medieval English sovereigns could endure very long periods of time lying in state, and were very often well preserved centuries after their death. When Elizabeth Woodville, Edward's queen, died at Bermondsey Abbey in June of 1492, her body, at her own request, was treated rather differently. She asked to be conveyed to Windsor on the same day as her death, and to be buried quickly with her husband in his burial vault, privately and with little ceremony. All the surviving sources suggest that this took place, and that she was buried with little pomp in the vault with her husband in a plain timber coffin. In March of 1789, as a new pavement was being laid in the north choir aisle of St George's Chapel, the entrance to King Edward IV's burial vault was accidentally discovered. Henry Emlyn, who was the clerk of works of the chapel and was superintending the laying of this pavement, entered the vault, and he made a series of careful drawings of it. Emlyn was a scholarly man. He was a fellow of the Society of Antiquaries of London, and his drawings and an account of the interior of the vault were published in their long-running journal series Vetusta Monumenta. Emlyn found that the vault was built of brick and had been constructed at the same time that this part of the chapel was erected, as one of the pillars, the stone pillars of the north arcade, rested on top of the brickwork, and so the vault was part of the planning of the chapel from the very beginning. On the brickwork in chalk, he found a whole series of inscriptions, including the name and numerals of the king. These were presumably made by the builders at the time of the construction of the vault, but for what purpose they left them there is not clear. The vault was entered, and there were found to be 2 coffins and skeletons within. At the bottom of the vault, resting on the chalk floor, the chalk bedrock, was a stout lead coffin, which was presumably that of the king. And placed on top of this coffin were the very decayed parts of a stout wooden coffin with a skull and some scattered bones, which were presumably all that remained of Queen Elizabeth Woodville. She was evidently not embalmed like her husband, but buried as requested in just a simple wooden coffin. The king, who had been embalmed, as we have seen, was still in his lead shell, which measured close to 7 foot long. The lead was of varying thicknesses, Emlyn said, and in places it was compressed, and in other places quite decayed. The king's remains within were mostly skeletonized, and the size and power of the skeleton when measured suggested that Edward was a heavily built man of around 6'3" tall. His lower legs and feet were submerged in a liquid that was contained within the lead shell. Some of this was taken away for testing by Dr. James Lind, the king's physician. It was a dark brown colour, he said, and had the appearance of walnut pickle. The usual taste and smell test was undertaken, and the liquid was said to have no smell and no taste, except for a roughness and astringency like water left in a wooden pail for too long. It wasn't, of course, water at all. The vault was built on the chalk bedrock above the water table, and the lead shell of the king was still sealed. This brown liquid that Dr. Lind tasted was the fluid from the decomposition of the king's body, trapped within the sealed lead. Surprisingly, there were no remains of any textiles in the king's coffin. There were, however, copious quantities of the king's long hair lying near the skull and neck, and Emlyn took from the vault a rather large sample of this dark blonde hair, and both the Royal Collection and the Society of Antiquaries have lockets containing it. Relatively recently, a locket even came up at public auction, which contains a little compartment under crystal with an image of an urn under weeping willows, painted in sepia and incorporating strands of the king's hair. A very curious relic. The vault was sealed up, and Emlyn constructed a new monument to Edward IV and Elizabeth Woodville with a black ledger stone over it to mark the royal sepulchre, and it has not been opened since, and Edward IV still lies buried there with his Queen in the Founder's Vault beside the high altar of St George's Chapel, Windsor. Thanks for watching. If you enjoy this channel, you're bound to enjoy my magazine, The Antiquary. Published every month, it is a labour of love for me, and in it I explore some of the more obscure aspects of our shared history, all beautifully illustrated in full colour. It ships across the world, is offered in print and digital format, and readers give it 5 stars on Google. If you love your history like me, particularly the history of objects, buildings, people and places, why not consider subscribing? Subscribing helps support my work and the channel too. There's a link above and in the video description that takes you to the magazine website.